Hi, this is Saintus and welcome back to Forge of Empires, and today I'm going to be reviewing the ages in this game from Tomorrow Era all the way up to Space Age Asteroid Belt. Now, starting off with Tomorrow's Era, it's a fairly easy age to go through. As for the units themselves, as I've said previously, they'll all be having these special skills. As for the anti-material sniper, it's not worth it. It doesn't have any particular skills. The combat drone can avoid artillery fire, so if the enemy has too many artilleries, you should just use this one. This is probably the only situation where you should. The Ultra AP essentially gets dropped randomly, so it's one of the first to attack. Not only that, it has contact, which means that it will retaliate against any strike. However, its range is not really that good, and it's quite weak, so I don't see any reason why you should use this as a main unit, at least in my opinion. As for the stealth tank, it's definitely an interesting unit. It's good overall, not amazing, but good. Essentially has uh, concealment in planes, and concealment in planes is a much better version of concealment than any other we've ever had. This is because planes are by far the most abundant type of terrain. Essentially, they are so abundant that they work like a sea or an ocean, and every other kind of terrain is just these pockets of or islands that you find in your map. And so with the stealth tank, you can not only always keep yourself concealed, but also occupy strategic positions in the battlefield. As for the other units, you'd have to compromise either concealment or your strategy, which would make them less efficient. As for the microwave blaster, it can counter stealth, which is the only counter to this tank. However, it's a weird unit for an artillery. It's by far the most mobile artillery. However, it has one of the shortest range. So this means that you have to use that mobility and get up close to your enemy, which means that you will also be attacked right after your turn. And because an artillery doesn't have enough defense, and you will lose it very quickly. So the stealth tank is probably the best unit, at least in my opinion. As for the great buildings, the Voyager V1 is terrible. I don't recommend it. And the Truce Tower, which used to be called Dynamic Tower, but it's essentially the same great building. They just changed its aspect and its name. It's also not worth it. Supply production is terrible, and the aid goods, as you can see over here, don't provide you with enough goods by far. If you're really early on and you want those goods of the higher ages, just get a good guild and try to collaborate with them. They'll be very willing to give you those higher, more valuable goods if you need them, because at their point, at the point that they're at in the game, they can definitely produce them very easily. Now moving on to the future era, this is one of the best in the game, at least one of the easiest ones. You'll most likely find yourself considerably increasing your military power. This is especially because of one particular unit. Anyway, everything else is pretty much standard, apart from this residential building, the arcology. It's an absolute monster. At a 6x6, it provides 8,000 people. I used to have these before building the innovation tower. It was a mistake. I should have already built the innovation tower. But anyway, it's really interesting for us to see this enormous 6x6 residential building. Anyway, as for the units, first of all, I'm going to start with the satellite spotter. The spotter is not really a good unit because although it has a good range, it can pretty much attack you right from the start. It doesn't have any particularly useful skill. In this case, it has heat, which removes 20% of attack bonus from your own army if you're attacked by it. Because it has a very weak defense, you'll be taken out really quickly. As for the drone swarm, it is dropped randomly in the battlefield, but it has a range of 1. Now, because it has a range of 1, that's already a major disadvantage against any other unit. Essentially, the other units can strike you without taking any retaliation, and whenever you have to strike them, you'll have to deal with the retaliation of the enemy. Now, moving on to the absolute best unit in the age, which is the hover tank. Now, the hover tank, um, is really good because not only does it have, like in previous age, concealment in the planes, like the stealth tank had, but it also has absorption, which means that your attack will always have a reduction of 1 to 2 points. So say because of your attack bonus you deal 3 points of damage to the hover tank, but because of its skill you're only going to be able to deal 2 in maximum, maybe 1, and this always increases its time in the battlefield and obviously the amount of damage it's able to deal. Um, Not only that, back in the day you used to have reactive armor. I believe you can only lose 3 points of health, which means that it would take more than 4 turns for you to defeat it because of the absorption, uh, which was devastating. It was absolutely amazing. It could destroy units from the Arctic future and more. Um, so we'd obviously lost the reactive armor, but it's still a pretty amazing unit. However, we have the exoskeleton soldier, which is one of its counters. It's really only there to counter the hover tank, nothing else. It doesn't have a particularly strong defense, um, but it can ignore stealth. So if you have too many hover tanks on the other side, you can use the exoskeleton. However, the other interesting unit here is the railgun. The railgun is really interesting because it's almost the opposite of the previous artillery unit. This has very low mobility, amazing range, but most importantly, it can ignore all of the other skills of any unit of any age. So it can ignore the concealment of the hover tank, it can ignore most importantly, and this is something that surprised me, you can ignore the skill for the drone swarm over here, and any light unit that can ignore artillery, this railgun can counter that. It can literally fire at units that were supposed to ignore artillery, which is really good. It's also quite powerful. However, it can only take one shot every 2 turns, so we'll fire once, and we'll reload, and it can't do anything, it just sit there and fire again, which means that in those 2 turns, your enemy can pretty much always reach you and defeat you. So this unit is overall very weak, even though it looks very interesting. It's quite weak. It's only the counter for the hover tank. Now moving on to the Arctic future, and this is where things get worse, or at least get slower. The Arctic future here, it's a really interesting one because at the time, I don't know if this was intended, but they gave the idea that the Arctic future was going to be one of the very last ages in this game. So, in order to extend the amount of time that people are going to be receiving this content, they increased it and split it into parts. In this case, 4 stages. And in those 4 stages, we received a certain amount of provinces and a certain amount of technologies. And this meant that we would end up with a very large content map. As you can see over here, I believe it has 40 or 30 provinces, I don't really know, but it's far more than in previous age. And obviously, as you can see here, 4,000 force points, which if you take a look over here at the list of force points required, it's more than twice as in previous age. But not only that, and I don't know if you have spotted, you have this new good. It's called Promethium, and it's a special good from the Arctic future. And how can you obtain it? Essentially, you need to research a technology in the tech tree that allows you to unlock this Arctic harbor. This Arctic harbor gets you access to a ship in which you have to use crew members, and those crew members cost 25 goods each, so you're looking to be spending on average 100 goods with the crew members, plus about 10 goods for every time that you do a trip. In this age, you're going to see a decrease in your overall production of goods or your increase of goods in your inventory because some of them will be going towards that Arctic harbor. And also, because of the way the tech tree is designed, if I go over here towards tech tree, if you look, because this was split into 4 parts, it's now incredibly narrow with just 1 or 2 technologies. In other words, it's going to take far more time for people to progress through. And of course, I also forgot to say, this age has about 10 more. This age has about 10 extra technologies, which is more than the future, so you'll see a lot of the players just slowing down their progress. because it takes them more time to research all of the technologies. As for the units, it gets a little bit different once more. In this case, you have your standard light units, artillery, fast and range units, but you have two heavy units, which is something completely new. Now, these units, for example, the Behemoth, one of the heavy units, is not worth it. It only has concealment in the hills, which are not abundant, and although it has absorption, that can easily be countered with obviously the plasma artillery. And the plasma artillery is a very dangerous unit. It can ignore stealth, has a very large range, and nice attack values. So it can not only counter the behemoth, but it's a bit of an annoyance towards the hover car. If you're still using that like I did, I used the hover car way into the higher ages, far beyond the future era. Anyway, the battle fortress is a little bit good. It has reactive armor. It can only lose 3 points. In this case, it means that it will take 4 tries or more to defeat this unit, but it doesn't have anything beyond that. The Dragon Drone can ignore artillery fire and has Dragon Breath. It means Dragon Breath essentially can attack units if they're all in a row of hexagons, one after another. And I think you can deal damage to about up to 3 units in total, which is somewhat good, but not really that strong because it only has a range of 1. It means that you need to get really up close to the enemy army, so it will most likely be taken out in the next turn. As for the Recon Raider, it is very fast, has a nice stack value, but it doesn't have any particular skill. Um, Although to be honest, it's still good enough, but the highlight of this age is the plasma artillery in my opinion. Then you have the surrogate soldier, which has contact. It means that it will retaliate against any strike from the enemy as long as it has enough range, which it does, but it is very weak regarding strike and defense, at least in my opinion. As for the great buildings, the Arctic Orange Reach definite plus. I advise to go for it, not as quickly as possible, but after you've built the other buildings that give you military boost, such as the Statue of Zeus and Castel del Monte. As for the Gaia statue, it is very bad as a great building. And Seed Vault, I don't like it. I would not build it. Helping Hands means that you will earn some rewards if you aid someone. Um, for the space that it occupies and for the forge points, it's definitely not worth it. The rewards, most of them, are not really that good. Anyway, moving on to the ocean future or oceanic future, it is by far the largest bottlenecking age, or it is the biggest age by far regarding technologies, forge points, and any increase in comparison to the previous ages. In this case, as you can see, you have 56 technologies, by far the biggest amount. It's absolutely crazy, and almost 10,000 forge points, more than twice of the previous age, which is already more than we were hoping for. This happened because the oceanic future was split into 6 different parts, and that was absolutely crazy, and that's also what allowed them to basically release so much content. The age itself, at least as you can see here, the continents or the provinces itself are split into 6 parts as well, and it results in a huge amount of provinces. It is good in one way, but to be honest, I don't really need that, and it slows down my progress if I'm not using diamonds, which is what I advise you to. You still need Promethium, and as a matter of fact, there's more Promethium than in the Arctic future, and of course, Orichalcum. Now, Orichalcum is the Oceanic Future's own special good and can be obtained in its own special harbor, just like in the Arctic future. In this case, you need 12 goods instead of 10 to repair the submarine at its cheapest, and each crew member requires you to spend 30 goods instead of 25, so it's a total of more than 130 goods at least for you to spend, which means that once again you'll have less goods in your inventory because of the orichalcum production. As for the units, this is where it gets even better because it's such a large unit. You have even more units. In this case, it is 2 units per class. They are not in the proper order. I don't know why, but anyway, I'm going to start with the hydroelectric eel, which is a fast unit. It can, I believe, conceal itself in bushes, but its range is not really amazing. However, it's still good overall as a unit. The next fast or light unit, I believe, are the gliders. Gliders can ignore artillery fire, which is quite good, but they only serve for that if you have too many artilleries on the enemy side, because they have very weak defense, And even though they have a bonus which is they'll have a defense boost depending on the amount of units they have right up next to them. So if you have one glider surrounded by 6 gliders, it has its maximum defense. It's still not really that good, and I don't advise you to use them, only if you have artillery. As for the sub-cruiser, I believe it's a ranged unit. Anyway, it has contact and basically retaliates against anyone who strikes it, and it does have the range for it. And it's also one of the first to attack, which is really good. The Nautilus is the other range unit, but it's very bad. It doesn't have any particular skill, I believe. I think it has absorption. Even if it does, it's a very bad unit overall. Now moving on to the light units, I believe we have the Manta and the... I don't know how to pronounce this. Anyway, the Manta is an interesting unit. It has contact as well, I believe. It also retaliates. However, it has a shorter range. Because it has a shorter range, it can be... You can avoid retaliation, but it has a chance of dealing you poison when it strikes you. Now, poison will take 1 point of health for every time that your unit strikes, but to be honest, it still takes far too much. Only in some specific situations in which your unit is very low on health is poison useful. So everything else not really that much. This other light unit essentially has Dragon Breath, and it has very high mobility, but like the previous unit in your feature with Dragon Breath, it only has a range of 1. Now with this range of 1, it means that it will most likely be attacked by the enemy and will not be able to retaliate. So it's also not really a good unit. I don't advise you to use it. Now moving on to the heavy units, you have the Octopod. The Octopod doesn't have any major skill as well, but I believe it has the highest attack and defense values in the entire age by far. However, again, because it doesn't have any unit, all you need to do is have a good attack bonus and you can very easily destroy the Octopod. As for the Crab, it has reactive armor. You can only lose 4 points of health every time, and this misery requires you 3 strikes or more in order to defeat this unit, uh, which makes it somewhat valuable. I would put it mid tier, not really that great or amazing, but it's not terrible. This is how I classify the Crab. And now for the 2 artilleries. Now let's talk about the turret. It's a bit weird. But anyway, this artillery has splash, and this splash means that it will deal damage to any unit within 2 hexagons of it in its distance, which means that it can pretty much destroy the crab or any unit that is stuck behind at least, and it's all concentrated. And that's actually the key in order to win a battle with this artillery. However, if you don't prefer that method, you also have the Medusa, which is also a good artillery. Essentially, it is dropped randomly in the battlefield and it can ignore concealment and has an amazing range. However, it cannot move. It is stuck in the ground forever, which is very bad for prolonged battles. It's actually terrible. But if the best way to defeating the enemy is to strike it as quickly as possible, the Medusa is very good for that. Anyway, as for the great buildings, finally, the Atlantis Museum, it's not good enough. The goods are already irrelevant at this stage, and the double plunder is only for people who are incredibly active in the neighborhood and are constantly plundering the enemies. Something that I don't do, and that the majority of people also don't. As for the Kraken, it provides you with forge points and first strike, which I've covered before. It is pretty amazing, and the Blue Galaxy is not good enough. So out of these 3, you should only build Kraken. As for the virtual future, things finally improved. Even though this was split into 3 parts, it's not really that huge or difficult age to go through as the previous 2, and there is no special good for it, which is really important. As for the units, we go back to just 5 in this age and beyond. However, these are not really that good, majority of them. For example, the Euronin bot just has absorption, nothing else as a heavy unit. It means that it can take some punches, essentially, but it can very easily still be defeated with just a strong attack boost. As for the Augmented Samurai and Warrior Monk, I don't remember their special skills, but essentially, because they only have a range of 1, This means that they will pretty much most likely be always at disadvantage, even against the hovercar, which I be used, I believe, against Virtual Future, but other units can deal with them. As for the ninja, it is dropped randomly in the battlefield and it has concealment in the trees, I believe, which makes it somewhat good, but that's pretty much it. I'll put it mid tier, and the absolute best is the rocket troop. This unit adds a much better version of the previous artillery splash damage in the oceanic future. Essentially, this unit has higher mobility, it still has splash damage, but it has a much higher attack value. And this is a trend that you see in both the virtual future and in the next age, which is that attack and defense values uh, increase by a lot. As for the great buildings, the Terracotta Army and Himeji Castle, I recommend you to build them both. As for the space age, uh, this is where they bring major change to the game. Essentially, when you reach the space age, you gain access to this rocket that takes you to a colony. And this colony, well, in my case, it is an asteroid, but when you reach space age Mars, it is access to Mars itself. And in this colony, you can produce space credits. And it's with these space credits that you'll now be obtaining the special good from space age Mars itself, which is Mars ore. And you can obtain Mars ore by conquering the provinces that have these special exploration sites. And once you finally conquer the provinces, you only have to spend space credits in order to essentially make a production that can last from like 4 hours to a day, I believe. And once they're completed, you need to either fight or negotiate to obtain said Mars ore. As for the goods themselves, it is the same situation as in Space Asteroid Belt over here. Essentially, the goods buildings are now on your colony, and this is really good. This means that you no longer need to have those goods buildings in your city, and you can demolish them in order to build more valuable buildings. In order for you to produce those goods from Space Age Mars, you need to spend not only coins and supplies, but also uh, Mars, or in the case of Space Age Mars. However, I must mention that Space Age Mars requires you to spend more than 7,000 of each of the goods, which is quite a lot more than what you used to. But anyway, it's still quite easy because now you can produce hundreds of goods in your colony, unlike in previous ages. The units themselves, they are pretty amazing. Overall, this is a great age for units. Let's start off with the weakest one. It is the sniper bot, the artillery. It doesn't have any particular skill, I believe. It only has a very high strike value against heavy units. The Space Marine has Dragon Breath, which it's not really that good, although it is better than in previous ages. It can attack units that are 4 hexagons away. As for the Tesla Walker, it is quite good because it is one of the first to attack, and it has a very strong attack. As for the Steel Warden, it is quite good. It has a high amount of defense and absorption, which means that it's pretty much the go-to unit in order to absorb damage. And the Sentinel is the one that can ignore artillery. So if you have too many artilleries on the enemy side, and because this is the first unit to strike, if those battles can only be won by striking very quickly, then the Sentinel is the way to go. As for the great buildings, the Stargazer, I don't advise you to have it. Basically, in order to earn previous era goods, you can have that with your event buildings. I already have. It's really easy to go. It's really easy to have. And the Virgo project, it's not good enough because the missile launch can only have, I think, up to 5 tries. This is at the absolute highest levels. Level 10, you only have like 3 or 4 tries, which is not enough considering the amount of fights that you can do every day. Now, finally, moving on to the last of the ages currently in this game, which is Space Age Asteroid Belt. It's pretty much like Space Age Mars, but everything has been increased by a notch or something. Essentially, you have to spend more forge points, more goods, and you have to spend more of asteroid ice. However, there is one thing that I definitely recommend you to do, and it's one of the most important things for you to do in this age if you don't want to be stuck on these older technologies, which is for you to collect the 11,500 of Mars ore and the 2,750 on average of each of the goods from Space Age Mars before you move on to Space Age Asteroid Belt, because by doing so, you lose access to your Mars colony, which means that you can no longer produce those goods, and you also lose access to the exploration sites. I mean, they're there, but you cannot produce anything from them. So definitely collect them before you move on to the next age. As for the units themselves, it is a disappointing age, mostly because there are some units that have a terrible range. So, for example, the Hoover or Hover Hammer and the Drill Ranger both have a range of 1, that already makes them terrible. And even though the Hover Hammer can ignore artillery fire, the Sentinel is much better because it has that higher range. It actually has range, unlike the Hover Hammer. As for the Shredder, it has a range of 2, which also makes it very bad. It does not have the absorptional force field as the previous unit from Space Age Mars. As for the Belt Artillery, it's sort of good. It's only really if you have an incredibly strong, say 200 or 400% defense enemy army with heavy units. That's probably the only situation. And as for the Nail Storm, it's probably the only unit that is somewhat good. It doesn't have contact, but it can conceal itself in rubble. However, there's something that I forgot to mention, I'm sorry. All the units from Space Age Mars have a very strong and powerful skill, which it's really what makes it so much better than the Virtual Future units, and this is why you must use them as quickly as possible, which is basically they have a 20% chance of dealing twice as much damage against the enemy units, which means that you can finally start to one-shot enemy units and need to bring that into your strategy. As for the Space Age Asteroid belt units, they have a 25% chance of dealing damage, which is even stronger. So whenever you're fighting, you need to take into consideration that the enemy might just one-shot your units. So you definitely need to take that into consideration. And so that was my final part of my review of the Ages in Forge of Empires. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you next time.